The city that never sleeps had begun to wind down as twilight bathed the streets of New York in muted hues. Keanu Reeves stepped out of the movie studio, the hum of another long day still lingering in his mind. The crisp evening air greeted him like an old friend, offering a brief moment of clarity. In his understated attire, worn jeans, a faded denim jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low, he blended seamlessly into the city's tapestry. Beside him trotted Andy, a lively beagle pup with floppy ears and a bounce in his step that mirrored pure, unbridled curiosity. Together, they moved through the world like two kindred spirits. Andy wasn't Keanu's dog, not officially. The puppy had been loaned to him by a professional animal trainer to help build chemistry for scenes in the upcoming John Wick film. Yet in just a few short days, Andy had carved a space in Keanu's heart. There was something undeniably infectious about the way the pup approached life, as if every corner, every smell, and every sound held a secret worth uncovering. Keanu often found himself smiling as Andy wagged his tail enthusiastically at a gust of wind or paused to inspect a piece of litter on the sidewalk. For all his worldly experiences, Keanu admired Andy's simple, innocent joy, a sharp contrast to the weariness that so many carried in their eyes. Their destination was the 14th Street Union Square subway station. Keanu had walked this route countless times before. Tonight, however, a faint unease tugged at him, though he couldn't quite place why. The familiar fluorescent lights of the station flickered and buzzed, casting uneven shadows along the concrete walls. The sights and sounds of the city's underbelly greeted him like a melancholic symphony. Rows of makeshift shelters and clusters of tattered tents lined the alcoves, home to those whose lives had been fractured by circumstance. It was a sobering reminder of the chasm between privilege and poverty, a reality Keanu had never taken for granted. As the buzz of activity faded, the deeper they went, Keanu's usual ritual began. His pocket jingled faintly with coins and small bills, which he distributed to the homeless individuals along the way. This nightly act wasn't one born of obligation or a desire for recognition. It was deeply personal, rooted in his understanding of dignity and humanity. Keanu moved from one person to the next, pausing briefly to exchange a few kind words or a knowing smile. "Here you go," he murmured, crouching down to hand a folded bill to an elderly man curled up against the wall. The man's face lit up, his weathered features softening. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu only nodded, giving a gentle pat on the man's shoulder before continuing. Andy, ever the curious companion, tugged slightly at the leash, sniffing the air. The pup's playful energy brought fleeting smiles to those they passed, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of life, a spark of light could still exist. Keanu's thoughts drifted as they made their way toward the platform. The rhythmic clinking of his boots against the station floor felt meditative, but his heart grew heavier with each step. He couldn't ignore the stark contrast between his life and the lives of those around him. He had always been acutely aware of his privilege, but tonight, it felt more palpable than usual. It wasn't just about the money he gave, it was about the connection, however brief, that he sought to make. He didn't pity them. He respected their resilience. At one corner, a young woman huddled with a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. Her eyes flickered with suspicion until Andy padded up to her, tail wagging. The sight of the puppy's cheerful demeanor softened her expression, and she reached out tentatively to stroke his fur. "This is your dog?" she asked, her voice hoarse but kind. "Not really," Keanu replied with a soft smile. "I'm just borrowing him for a while." The woman nodded, her lips curving upward slightly. "He's a good one. Animals, they just know, don't they?" Keanu couldn't help but agree. As Andy licked her hand, the woman's face broke into a genuine smile, a moment of joy in what appeared to be a life filled with struggle. The station grew quieter as Keanu approached the platform, his senses heightened by the faint buzz of unease that still lingered. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the faces and shadows. Andy's leash pulled taut as the pup sniffed curiously at a nearby column. Keanu smiled faintly, his thoughts momentarily distracted by the dog's boundless energy. But then, he caught a glimpse of something, a movement in the corner of his eye that didn't sit right. A group of men lingered by the edge of the platform, their postures predatory and their laughter sharp against the stillness. Keanu's gut twisted as they turned their attention toward him. He adjusted his grip on Andy's leash, his calm demeanor masking the unease bubbling beneath the surface. Well, one of the men sneered, stepping closer. What do we have here? A lost little puppy and his owner? Keanu stayed rooted, his voice steady as he replied, I'm just waiting for my train. The man chuckled, his companions closing in behind him. Waiting for your train? Huh? Looks to me like you're waiting to get robbed. Keanu's heart pounded as he instinctively stepped in front of Andy, shielding the dog from their view. His mind raced, weighing his options. He had faced danger in the past, but this felt different, more immediate, more raw. The men's eyes gleamed with malice, and their laughter echoed in the hollow space of the station. As the tension thickened, Keanu's thoughts shifted to the people he had passed earlier, the elderly man, the young woman, the countless others who called this station home. For them, this kind of danger was a daily reality. Keanu had always admired their resilience, but now he was experiencing firsthand the fear they must carry with them. And yet, even in the face of that fear, Keanu refused to let it paralyze him. He glanced down at Andy, who wagged his tail nervously, and a surge of determination coursed through him. This wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about standing up against the cruelty and indifference that so often went unchecked. What happened next would test Keanu in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it would also reaffirm his belief in humanity's capacity for kindness and courage. It wasn't just about survival. It was about finding hope in the most unlikely of places. Here you go, Keanu said gently, handing a few folded bills to an elderly woman bundled tightly in a tattered blanket. Her weathered face lifted toward him, and for a moment, the harsh lines of hardship softened into a smile of gratitude. God bless you, young man, she murmured, her voice quivering with emotion that spoke volumes. Keanu returned her smile with a quiet nod, his gesture sincere. Before continuing on, Andy, blissfully unaware of the somber atmosphere, wagged his tail and sniffed curiously at the air. His innocent enthusiasm caught the attention of several onlookers, their weary expressions momentarily easing into faint smiles. It was as though Andy's small, joyful presence served as a fleeting reminder of simpler, happier times. Watching this, Keanu couldn't help but feel the weight of the stark contrast between his life and theirs. The disparity pressed heavily on his heart, a silent ache that words couldn't quite capture. As they continued their slow walk through the dimly lit subway station, Keanu's thoughts lingered on the lives of those around him, their stories written in every wrinkle, every tattered belonging, every guarded glance. Yet, there was resilience, too, a quiet strength that refused to fade, even in the face of unrelenting adversity. When they approached a familiar corner near the alcove, Keanu noticed something was wrong. The usual warm greeting from Max, a homeless man he had come to know over the past weeks, was conspicuously absent. Max, always quick with a smile and a story, was rarely without his tiny, spirited chihuahua, Button. But tonight, the spot where Max's makeshift home stood was eerily silent, and Keanu felt a twinge of unease ripple through him. Max? Keanu called softly, concern threading his voice as he took a step closer. A faint rustling sound came from within the tent, followed by the slow, labored emergence of Max himself. Keanu's breath caught as Max came into view, his face bruised and lined with an unfamiliar sorrow. The usual spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far heavier. Oh, hey, Keanu, Max mumbled, his voice low and brittle. He lowered himself onto a worn crate outside the tent, his hands trembling faintly as he tried, and failed, to muster a smile. The forced expression didn't reach his eyes, and Keanu felt his stomach tighten. Keanu crouched down to meet Max's gaze, his tone filled with gentle urgency. Max, what happened? Are you hurt? And where's Button? At the mention of Button, Max's composure crumbled, his shoulders slumped, and his breathing hitched as he fought to steady himself. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, empty dog collar. The sight of it struck Keanu like a physical blow, and his heart sank further. They took her, Max choked out, his voice thick with anguish. Those bastards took my button." Keanu leaned in closer, his voice steady but full of concern. "Who? Max? Who took her? What happened?" Max inhaled shakily, his hands gripping the collar like a lifeline as he struggled to piece the words together. "It was last night," he began, his voice barely audible. "A group of guys, they've been coming around lately, calling themselves the owners of this place. They say we have to pay them for protection." He spat the last word bitterly, his face twisting with anger and pain. "I never have anything to give them, so they rough me up a little and move on." Keanu's jaw tightened, his hands instinctively balling into fists as Max continued. "But last night was different," Max said, his voice breaking. "Button, she tried to protect me. She's always been brave. My little girl." He swallowed hard, his words tumbling out faster now, as though speaking them aloud might lessen the weight on his chest. "She barked at them, tried to scare them off. And then she bit one of them on the ankle." Keanu closed his eyes briefly, already dreading what was coming next. Max's trembling hand moved to the dark bruise near his temple, his voice cracking under the strain of his memory. "They went crazy," Max said, his tone raw with guilt and sorrow. "One of them kicked her. She yelped, and I tried to grab her, to shield her. But then," his voice faltered, and he shook his head as if trying to clear the image from his mind. "Then one of them hit me with a bat. That's all I remember. When I came to, she was gone." Max's voice trailed off, his gaze falling to the ground as tears slipped down his cheeks. The empty collar in his hands seemed to weigh more than the world itself. Keanu reached out, placing a steady hand on Max's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Max," he said softly, his words filled with genuine empathy. "Do you think there's any chance she's still?" He hesitated, unable to finish the sentence. Max shook his head, his expression hollow. If anyone had seen her, I'd know by now. Word travels fast down here." "Keanu, it's been silent. And those guys," he exhaled shakily, "they're not the type to show mercy." Keanu's mind raced, grappling with the injustice of it all. The thought of Button, a creature so small, so full of life, suffering at the hands of such cruelty ignited a fire in his chest. He thought of Andy, sitting quietly at his side, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude that the beagle was safe. "Max," Keanu said, his voice firm but kind, "we're going to figure this out. You're not alone in this." Max glanced at him, his eyes glistening with both gratitude and doubt. "What can you do, Keanu? People like them, they don't answer to anyone." Keanu straightened, determination hardening his features. "Maybe not," he replied, "but that doesn't mean we let them get away with this." Andy, sensing the shift in his companion's energy, stood and wagged his tail, his brown eyes reflecting unwavering trust. As Keanu looked down at the little beagle, he made a silent promise, not just to Max but to himself. This wasn't just about finding Button. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, no matter the odds. With a renewed sense of purpose, Keanu helped Max back into his tent, his mind already working through a plan. This was far from over. Keanu's chest tightened as he listened to Max's words, the anguish in the man's voice cutting deeper than any wound. "Max, I'm so sorry," Keanu said, his voice low and weighted with sincerity. He crouched down to meet Max's tearful gaze, his hand resting gently on the older man's shoulder. "We'll find her. I don't know how yet, but we will make this right." Max let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he stared at the empty collar in his hands. His voice, cracked with despair, was barely above a whisper. "People like me, Keanu, we don't get justice. Nobody cares about a homeless man or his dog. The police won't even look our way." Keanu's heart broke at the resignation in Max's tone, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded solemnly, understanding the depth of Max's hopelessness while silently vowing to himself that he wouldn't let this injustice stand. As Keanu continued toward the subway platform, Andy trotted dutifully by his side. The night's cold air seemed heavier, weighed down by the burden of what he had just heard. Keanu's thoughts churned, Max's words echoed in his mind, each one a sharp reminder of the cruelty that too often went unchecked in the world. The injustice gnawed at him, a gnawing he couldn't ignore. Andy nudged Keanu's leg with his nose, his wide brown eyes brimming with the simple, wordless empathy only a dog could offer. Keanu crouched down briefly, scratching behind the puppy's floppy ears and drawing strength from the innocent creature's unwavering companionship. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured softly. Andy wagged his tail in response, a flicker of light in the growing darkness of Keanu's thoughts. The quiet of the platform was soon disrupted by the sound of heavy boots scraping against the concrete. Keanu looked up to see three men swaggering toward him, their expressions hard and predatory. He recognized them instantly. Max's vivid description of the thugs who had taken Button left no room for doubt. The tallest of the three, a wiry man with cruel eyes and a smirk that reeked of malice, sneered as he approached. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do we have here? A new hobo?" Keanu straightened his posture, his calm demeanor masking the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm just waiting for my train," he said, his voice measured and steady. The men exchanged amused glances, their sneers widening. They weren't here to talk, they were here to intimidate. One of them stepped forward, shoving Keanu lightly on the shoulder as if testing him. "Let's see what you've got." Then, he drawled, "Empty your pockets." Keanu, ever calm under pressure, reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. Without a word, he handed it over, his eyes never leaving the men in front of him. The tallest thug flipped it open, scoffing as he rifled through its sparse contents. $20, he barked, throwing the wallet back at Keanu with disdain. Pathetic. Keanu caught the wallet and slipped it back into his pocket, his focus still on the men. He hoped they would take what they wanted and move on. But their attention soon shifted to Andy, the smallest of the three. A stocky man with a twisted grin pointed at the beagle. "What's this?" he sneered. "A rich guy's mutt? Looks too clean to be yours." Before Keanu could respond, the thug leaned down and spat near the dog, the action eliciting a low growl from Andy. Keanu's jaw clenched, his voice firm as he took a step forward. "Leave him alone," he said, his tone brooking no argument. But the men had no intention of backing off. The stocky one knocked over Keanu's coffee cup, the warm liquid spilling across the ground. Andy yelped, startled by the commotion, and the tallest thug seized the moment to grab the puppy's leash. Keanu stepped forward instinctively, his hands reaching for the leash as desperation tightened his chest. "Let him go," he demanded, his voice sharp and unwavering. The men only laughed, their taunts growing louder as they pulled the terrified dog toward them. "What are you gonna do about it?" one of them jeered, yanking the leash hard enough to make Andy whimper. Keanu's composure cracked as anger surged through him. He moved quickly, grabbing the leash and trying to wrest it back, but the odds were against him. The three men closed ranks, shoving him backward as they made their escape. Keanu stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his eyes fixed on the retreating figures. "Andy," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty station. The little beagle barked frantically, his cries growing fainter as the men disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, Keanu stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened washing over him in a wave of helplessness and anger. Andy, the puppy he had grown so attached to in their short time together, was gone, taken by the very men who had already caused so much harm. As the adrenaline faded, Keanu's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind raced, not with fear, but with determination. He had promised Max they would find Button, and now, that promise extended to Andy. He wouldn't let this stand, not for Max, not for Andy, and not for himself. Keanu took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he would make this right. Keanu stood frozen on the subway platform, his heart pounding and his mind racing. The overwhelming sense of loss wasn't just about Andy. It was about the cruelty and helplessness the situation represented. He had failed to shield the innocent, and now the fate of the little beagle hung in the balance. The weight of his emotions bore down heavily, but Keanu refused to let despair take hold. Somewhere deep within him, a fire was rekindling, fueled by determination and the knowledge that giving up was not an option. As he struggled to plan his next move, a familiar voice cut through the haze of his thoughts. "Keanu," I know where they are. Keanu spun around to see Max rushing toward him, breathless but resolute. His face, still marked by recent bruises, carried a newfound sense of urgency. Word travels fast down here, Max said, his voice a mix of hope and urgency. Some folks saw them. They told me where they might be. Keanu felt a surge of hope. Lead the way, he said without hesitation. Together, they moved quickly through the dimly lit corridors of the subway station. The quiet echo of their footsteps mingled with the distant rumble of passing trains. Adding to the tension, Max guided Keanu through the winding maze of tunnels, his knowledge of the hidden corners of the station proving invaluable. Keanu stayed close, his senses on high alert, his resolve hardening with every step. Finally, they reached a secluded alcove bathed in a dim, flickering light. There, the three thugs were gathered, laughing as they sorted through the spoils of their night's cruelty. Andy's leash lay coiled nearby, and Keanu's stomach twisted at the sight of the little dog trembling in fear. Tethered to a makeshift post, Keanu stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. I'm here for the dog, he said firmly, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the men. And the necklace you stole. The tallest thug, Bowie, turned to face him, a sneer curling on his lips. You again, he said mockingly. Didn't you learn your lesson the first time? His companions chuckled, their confidence bolstered by their numbers and weapons. But before Keanu could respond, movement in the shadows caught their attention. One by one, figures began emerging from the darkness, members of the homeless community. Stepping forward with quiet determination, men and women, young and old, surrounded the alcove, forming a protective barrier around Keanu and Max. This man has shown us kindness, said an older man with a gray beard, his voice firm and steady. He's been there for us. Now we're here for him. The thugs faltered, their smirks fading as they took in the sheer number of people standing against them. Their bravado crumbled in the face of overwhelming solidarity. One of the men shifted uncomfortably, the bat in his hand drooping slightly as doubt crept into his expression. Keanu didn't wait for them to recover. He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. This is over, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Give me back the dog. Return the necklace. You're done here. The tension hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The tallest thug, his earlier confidence now reduced to bravado, finally tossed the necklace at Keanu's feet. Take it, he muttered bitterly. We don't want any more trouble. Max moved forward quickly, his eyes scanning for Button. His hands trembled as he called out softly, Button, where's my girl? From a pile of discarded belongings, a small, shivering shape emerged. The tiny chihuahua ran to Max with a joyful yip, her tail wagging furiously. Max dropped to his knees, scooping Button into his arms and holding her close. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered words of comfort to his loyal companion, his voice cracking with emotion. I've got you, Button. You're safe now. Meanwhile, Andy barked excitedly, tugging against his leash. Keanu crouched down, scooping the beagle into his arms. The little dog licked his face fervently, his tail wagging with uncontainable joy. Keanu held him close, relief washing over him in waves. You're okay now, buddy, he murmured. I've got you. The circle of onlookers erupted in applause and cheers, their collective victory filling the air with a palpable sense of unity. The thugs, thoroughly outmatched and humiliated, slinked away into the night, their earlier bravado replaced by silent defeat. Keanu stood and turned to the group, his eyes glistening with gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've reminded me of something I needed to remember tonight. Together, we are stronger than the cruelty around us. The older man with the gray beard stepped forward, nodding in agreement. Kindness has a way of coming full circle, he said simply. You've been good to us, Keanu. We just returned the favor. Keanu smiled faintly, the warmth of their support filling a space in his heart he hadn't realized was empty. As he looked around at the faces of those who had stood with him, he felt an overwhelming sense of connection and hope. These were people society often ignored, yet tonight they had shown a strength and courage that transcended any label. As the group began to disperse, Keanu knelt beside Max. You're not alone in this. he said softly. "If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." Max nodded, still cradling Button in his arms. "Thank you, Keanu," he said, his voice raw with gratitude, "for everything." Together, they walked back toward the main platform, the events of the night leaving an indelible mark on them both. The city above was still buzzing with life, but Keanu knew he had witnessed something extraordinary beneath its surface, something raw, real, and profoundly human. As Keanu stepped onto the train with Andy at his side, he looked out at Max and gave him a small, parting nod. The train doors closed, separating them physically but not in spirit. Keanu glanced down at Andy, who had already curled up at his feet, his tail wagging contentedly. The weight of the night lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. Keanu knew the fight wasn't over, not for Max, not for others like him, and not for the city that held so much pain and potential. But tonight, he had been reminded that even in the face of darkness, there was light to be found in connection, solidarity, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And that was enough to keep him going. As Keanu and Max emerged from the dim confines of the subway station, the night air felt different, lighter, almost as though the world had exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Andy trotted happily beside Keanu, his small tail wagging with the uncontainable joy of being safe once more. In Max's arms, Button nestled close, the tiny chihuahua finding comfort in her owner's steady embrace. The streets, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights, seemed to shimmer with a renewed sense of hope. For Keanu, the events of the night weren't just a passing ordeal, they were a profound reminder of the resilience and strength that could be found in the most unexpected places. He glanced at Max, whose bruised face now bore a tentative but genuine smile, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. This wasn't just about rescuing two dogs or confronting a group of thugs. It was about standing up for the vulnerable, about proving that compassion and courage still had a place in the world. Walking side by side, Keanu and Max barely exchanged words. They didn't need to. The shared experience of the night had forged a quiet bond between them, a connection built on trust and the mutual understanding of life's challenges. Yet, as they passed by the shadows of the city's alleyways and the faces of others still weathering the storms of life, Keanu felt the weight of an undeniable truth. This victory, while meaningful, was just one step in a much larger fight. Keanu broke the silence as they reached the intersection where their paths would part. "Max," he said, his voice steady but earnest, "this isn't the end. We got through tonight. But there's more we can do, more we have to do." Max paused, his eyes searching Keanu's face. "You've already done so much," he replied, his tone tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "Why would you keep going? You don't owe us anything." Keanu shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's where you're wrong, Max. We all owe each other something. A little kindness, a little understanding. That's how the world gets better." The sincerity in Keanu's words left Max silent, his grip on Button tightening as he nodded. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out a card and handing it to Max. "Call this number," he said. "It's a friend of mine who works with an organization that helps people get back on their feet. They'll connect you with resources, job training, housing assistance, whatever you need." Max stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this, for everything." Keanu smiled warmly, patting Max on the shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Max, and take care of Button." As they went their separate ways, Keanu felt a quiet resolve solidify within him. This night had reminded him that change didn't require grand gestures or wealth. It began with small acts of kindness, with choosing to see and uplift those who were too often ignored. It wasn't just the end of a harrowing evening. It was the beginning of a mission. Keanu wasn't just an actor or a celebrity tonight. He was a man with a purpose, determined to make the world a kinder, more compassionate place. For Keanu, that was a fight worth taking on, and he knew, without a doubt, it was one he wouldn't fight alone. As Keanu walked toward the faint glow of the city's skyline, his thoughts lingered on the faces he'd encountered that night. Max, bruised but smiling, holding on to Button like a lifeline. Andy, whose wagging tail and joyful energy belied the hardship he'd just escaped. The people in the shadows, unnoticed by the bustling city above, each carrying untold stories of struggle and resilience. Every step Keanu took felt heavier with the weight of those lives, but it was a burden he willingly embraced. He thought back to Max's words, "You don't owe us anything." But the truth was, Keanu felt he did. He had been blessed with opportunities, resources, and a platform. And tonight had reminded him that these blessings weren't just privileges, they were responsibilities. The world could be harsh, but he had the power to soften its edges for those who needed it most. And if not him, then who? As he crossed the street, Andy trotting happily at his side, Keanu's phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from a friend lit up the screen, inviting him to a high-profile event the following evening. Keanu hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He had attended countless glamorous galas, all filled with speeches and promises. But tonight had shown him where his time and energy truly belonged. He tucked the phone away, resolving to reach out to the organization he'd mentioned to Max. He wanted to do more than connect people to resources. He wanted to be part of the solution. Passing by a late-night diner, Keanu caught his reflection in the window. His face looked tired, lined with exhaustion, but there was something else there, too, a spark of purpose. He remembered what he had told Max, "We all owe each other something." And he realized that the most important work of his life wasn't behind him, it was ahead. In every choice he made, every small act of kindness that could ripple outward and create change. By the time he reached his apartment, the first rays of dawn were beginning to color the sky. Keanu stood for a moment on the threshold, looking back at the quiet streets that had borne witness to the night's events. He felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that even in the vastness of the city's struggles, small victories mattered. Max's smile, Button's safety, and Andy's wagging tail were proof that light could always break through the darkness. As he stepped inside, Keanu made a silent promise to himself. He would continue this fight, not for recognition or accolades, but because it was the right thing to do. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he felt ready to face it, one step, one person, and one act of kindness at a time. Because in the end, that's how the world changes, not in great, sweeping movements, but in the quiet, powerful moments when we choose to care.